did a series, it ended up being a series, on this guy named Teilhard de Chardin. So I'm sure you guys are going to laugh about this, but I'm kind of assuming you already know about him and have some facility with his thought. Darn. Come on now.
I did some research.
Oh, good.
I did that individually.
Well, it's okay. Well, I'll give you a little intro, but you don't have to really have any prior knowledge, obviously. I'm just sort of kidding around. So I like to do this talk in Advent because, of course, Advent is the season we're preparing for Christmas, which is the celebration of the incarnation. So part of the two thinkers that we're talking about, Teilhard de Chardin and Ilia Dahlio, their whole thing was, how do we make Christ relevant for today? Or in their terminology, how do we update Christology for our new worldview? Christology means the thinking of Christ, about what Christ is and who Christ is for us today. And both of them were scientists. De Chardin was a geologist, and Ilia Dahlio was a sort of a medical scientist. She studied medical physiology, and then I think later spine surgery, interestingly enough. And I'll tell you a little bit more about her story as we go. But so I call this Christ in the universe, and that's an icon of creation. So actually that is God creating, but look what he looks like. He looks like Jesus doing it. So it's the whole idea that the Word was in the beginning. So Christ is both sort of the Alpha, the Omega. Christ is in all of creation. And that's kind of the message that these guys are going to get. And we'll unpack that, but that's sort of the message that we're getting at. All right, so de Chardin, who was he? He was this Jesuit priest, grew up in France, and went to a Jesuit high school. Pretty immediately after high school, joined the Jesuits. Though back in those days, people would actually go one of my friends actually, one of my good friends who was priest at my ordination, he was in seminary in high school in the Roman Catholic Church. It's like, can you imagine? Now he's an Episcopal priest, but anyway. De Chardin was in a Jesuit high school in France, and then became a Jesuit, and later, and the Jesuits always use, their sort of training is they get another degree, usually like an academic degree of some kind, and it can be anything. Like there's Jesuit doctors, but he turned out to be a geologist, and he did most of his professional work in science. He's the one that discovered Peking Man, if you ever remember that, anybody? And Peking Man, they no longer call it Peking Man. He was involved, by the way. He wasn't the only one. He was the geologist on that study. But they don't call it Peking. I think he's part of Homo erectus now or something like that. But anyway, he was this discoverer of early evolution, early human evolution. So from his beginnings, he thought about evolution and how that impacted his religious belief, which was strong. And so this is something from his earliest writings. This is during World War I, by the way. So he goes to high school and gets ordained before World War I, and then he actually goes into World War I, and he's not an ambulance driver, but there's no ambulances, a stretcher bearer back in World War I. So he is writing sort of in the trenches of World War I, and he says, the body of Christ, he says in his earliest writings, is both heavenly and an earthly body. Okay? So it permeates the whole universe and infuses matter with a meaning beyond its mere materiality. But in so doing, Christ does not make, by God becoming Christ, does not make the material any less material. And so what makes matter itself spiritual, he thinks, is the very fact that the Spirit pushes us beyond what we are, okay? Pushes the universe beyond what it is. So if you can see from his very beginning, his earliest writings, he's thinking sort of evolutionarily, he's thinking about this dynamic universe. Now, why is that important? Why do I even bring that up? Why do I say, oh, look, he's thinking about, as if that's a major, discovery? And I'm asking you guys for real, why do you think I'm making a point about that?
It brings science and religion together.
It does. It is one way of doing that, exactly. So, if you were going to read if you were back in the days when the Bible was written, and you could talk to one of their scientists, which were more like philosophers back then, how would they understand the universe? Was it dynamic? I guess I'm asking. Like, was it evolving?
It was, but they may not have recognized it.
Right, exactly. They did not. They thought it wasn't. They thought it was fixed. They thought that God had thought up all the species, made all the species, that's it. Okay? And so the world was really like, it was just, time was kind of like, just cyclical, more than linear. It wasn't going somewhere. It was sort of just doing the same thing over and over again. Now look, that's kind of what we do, right? I mean, we get up, go to work, come home, go to bed, and then our weeks are we work during the week, then we go to church on Sundays, like our seasons go, cyclical time is not exactly like non-intuitive. It's pretty intuitive,
Well,
So,
it is very cyclical. It just is also linear.
well, but
You're
then,
too close to it to see the linearity
Yes.
of it.
I don't think our mind goes like this. I think back then it did go like this.
yes,
Ah.
right.
Our minds
are
move
linear.
forward, yeah.
Yes,
Our
I
mind has
totally
left
agree.
that cyclical area.
Yes, that's right. So to get yourself back in that ancient worldview, like you got to think that they did not really think of time as linear. They thought it as, they thought of it more as recurrent, And please don't take that too far. Obviously, they had a sense that there was a birth, there was adulthood, and there was death. In some sense, that's a linear time period. But the point is they didn't think of the whole universe as the universe was created, and that's it. So what he's saying, when he says this, he's trying to say to the church, hey, we need to wake up, because people don't think the way we thought back then. Think of, and I've used this example before. This is less about time, but more about space, right? So think of the ascension of Christ, right? So the bodily ascension of Christ after Pentecost, or right before Pentecost, I should say. So how fast do you think Christ was moving up into the air, like in terms of miles per hour? Not very fast, right? That'd be kind of weird if you just so it seems like he's like just kind of floating up there. So we'll say 5 miles an hour.
So it's more like a parade.
Yeah, like a balloon kind of going up in the air. So if that was the case, and you thought about modern day space, where do you think he'd be about now after 2000? He'd barely be making it out of our solar system, So when you think about this ancient biology and ancient cosmology, like they were living in a different worldview. For them, the Earth was at the center, and then there was this series of what they called spheres, right? And if you stand out and watch the stars, what do the stars do in the sky? They spin. Like that's the one thing that people don't. People think they're going like this, but actually they all spin around what point? What point do they spin on?
The sun.
No,
Their axis.
we spin around the sun.
Okay.
What?
Their own axis.
No,
The Milky Way.
no. The North Star.
Oh.
The North Star. Why? Because the way the Earth's pointed and all that stuff. So just don't little. But anyway, that's what everything's doing. Go out and watch. And go out, find the North Star, find the Big Dipper. You'll see the Big Dipper go wink, 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 wink during the night.
Yeah.
So anyway, so this is why this was so big. And in fact, he was condemned, and most of his writings were hidden for a while and stuff like that. So anyway, he says, my starting point is the fundamental initial fact that each one of us is perforce, that's misspelling, perforce linked by all the material, organic, and psychic strands of his being to all that surrounds him. Not only is he caught up in the network, he is carried along too by a stream. We're all interconnected elements of one and the same curve that extends ahead and reaches back behind us. So what do you guys, tell me what that means. What's he saying? Because remember, he's the guy that'll say, how does he put it? Like, I'm not a part of the universe is part of me, or something like that. Or I'm not universe that's acting out my own life or something like that. I'm like the whole universe that's acting out part of the universe's life. That's one of the things he'll say. But don't worry about that statement. But just, what do you think he's saying here? They're both related, the two quotes. Anybody?
Just the connectedness
Well,
of the
somehow-
universe.
In what sense? How is he connecting it?
To the future and the past. And that
In-
it's all in,
That's exactly right. So temporally he's connecting it. What though is he actually connecting? Like, so you're right, he is connecting it temporally, but when I say, Becky, you are connected to the whole universe, its past and its present and in some sense its future, what do I mean?
well, there's a
Stream is
physicality.
evolution.
The stream of evolution, the evolution of what? Of the material world, right? So the chemicals that make up our body were born in the Big Bang.
Right. The physicality that continues.
Physicality, exactly. Like he's very physical in this.
I
Yeah,
totally,
agree.
you probably have some George Washington Adams in you.
Right, exactly. And later we'll talk about the psychic strands in a second. Like, what does that mean? Why? So we just talked about material, but why psychic too?
When was de Chardin doing?
So the years that he died in the 60s. Like a lot of his work happened in the 50s and 40s and 30s. Like, and then of course this is World War I. So he hasn't yet gone off and done a lot of his science. He's been trained as a scientist by this point, but he hasn't done a lot of his science yet. After this he'll go to China, and that's where they get. I said, what did I say? Did I say Peking Man?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, Peking Man. Yeah. Okay. So this is just to give you a sense of our sense of the time scale, right? So this is taken from the Webb telescope, and it's infrared, so it was actually doctored or whatever. So now it's the light from I don't know which star, but is 13.8 billion years old. What? And then we'll get to that, but anyway, so he, like de Chardin, thought if we're going to grow spiritually, not just materially, but if we're going to grow spiritually, we don't do it by withdrawing from our material reality. And I don't just mean like our bodies, but the life of the world, our lives in the world, with each other. Not out, but ought to be able to see the work going on around us and to awaken to the cosmos. He thought that his writings were helping us see. He wanted us to have this vision of God in the universe, in the world, in each other, in our actions, like in our lives. That was his big thing. He wanted us to be able to see this. And he thought, and he's the one that used the term sacred evolution. He said evolution is sacred not just because it's a generator of new life, but also because it is what he called an instrument of beatification. And in other words, we ourselves evolved with the cosmos. Mike and I were just talking earlier. He was like, do you think our intelligence is different now than it was 2,000 years ago? Not like, do we think we know more things than they did, but our actual intelligence, is that different? And it's a good question. It probably is. The way we actually think. And that's what makes it hard sometimes to go back and read these texts, right? And be like, oh, the Virgin Mary. And we're all like, what? But they were like, oh yeah, of course, the Virgin Mary. Yeah, of course she was a virgin. Like, why not? That'd be silly if she wasn't. I mean, she gave birth to a god. So, and also because the diamonds of the universe can be a source of hope if we just discover God's movement in it. Now, that's kind of an interesting thought, right? Like, could this actually give us hope for the future if we thought that this was a process that God was working through, Because it's not easy to see all the time. This is a way of depicting evolution of life, So each of these is a time, So like, what is it? I think 1 billion years ago, maybe, or no, 4 billion, because that's the Earth. 4 billion years ago, 3 billion, 2 billion, 1 billion. So you could see like the way that. Look at all this, and then look at all the dead ends. Where are we again? there are dead ends even in our like almost immediate branches. So anyway, that's pretty fascinating too, right? I mean, like, jeez, and like that's just talking about categories. That's not talking about individual lives.
That thing where they say the miracle of the people who made it through to get you to
Yeah.
be here,
Yeah.
and all of the people who had to make it through
Yeah.
everything, and that's just down in this little bitty
Yeah,
corner.
right. Not even here. Yeah, exactly. You know, remember back to that whole idea of we're all connected, right? Like, so this is kind of a visualization of that connectivity. There's the dinosaurs. They don't depict all the extinct species, but look at how far. That's not that far. It doesn't seem.
So should we say that God was making mistakes all the way?
That's a good question. Uh-oh, what happened here?
I would say he made things that didn't take advantage of their opportunities.
Oh.
Yeah. There you go.
Different characteristics for you. See what you can do with that. There is a success path, but maybe
He
you'll
made
find it
he
maybe
made the perfect process is what he did.
That's right. Let me, when I formatted this slide, it became a little crazy. Let me see if I can change the design of it. Let me see.
Can you change your?
I think I can do it that way. There we go. But what's the trouble with evolution? And I don't think you guys have to probably know, like you probably know this, right? I mean, you know why people get so scared of evolution. And I mean religious folks especially, you know. So the first thing is that it's got a randomness built into it, right? So like Darwin thought that these mutations happened randomly. There was no design necessarily in the mutations. They just happen, and then whatever survives is what is carried on to the next generation. And if the mutations are dramatic enough, you'll get the birth of a new species. And I don't know did we talk about, like, remember, I think I said this, that the ancient thought was that all the species of the universe were created at creation. All the species. There was no new species. So that was another radical thing about Darwin, you know. So, you know, for Darwin, though, you can almost think of an organism as a solution to the problem of an environment, right? Isn't that kind of an interesting way to think about it? So, now, the problem with randomness is that people feel like it immediately discounts the idea that God could have done anything. If it's truly random, then there's really no purpose at all. But, and we can introduce this a little bit, but what if you just thought of, and this is how these guys think about it, what if you just thought that creation was not a completely, using this term in a slightly different way, a completely linear thing? Like, what if this is what science says a lot, for something to be created, a lot of times something else needs to be destroyed. Like development doesn't go just building block upon building block, right? Development happens because parts come together and a new whole is formed. The old whole is gone. A zygote doesn't stay a zygote, right? It becomes a blastocyst and then an embryo and all that stuff. So I think the idea of dead ends in evolution is not necessarily a bad thing. It's kind of interesting. And it's also interesting for our own lives.
It's still the path forward.
Right.
It is still the only path
Right.
forward.
And you remember when we talked about destiny, remember you were talking about what if I pick the wrong path? There's no wrong path. You get a dead end, you turn around unless you die. You turn around and go the other way. And if you do die, maybe you left your whatever to the next person. And your atoms become part of the next George Washington. Right?
The matter is finite.
That's right. Well, matter never
Form is
changes
different.
form, but not
Right.
destroyed. Right. Now, the last thing that I want to just point out is, right after Darwin, there became all these social Darwinists, right? Like, survival of the fittest. That means, like, let's apply that to human societies. Well, human societies don't act in the same way. You could think of them analogously to evolution, but we're not mutating or something, but there is this sort of sense when you say, remember, what does the fittest mean in biology? What does it mean to be the fittest?
Able to procreate.
Right, able to procreate in that
Exist in
particular
your
environment. It fits
Survive
into the
in your
environment, yes. It really is more about fittedness or appropriateness, not about, am I the strongest? Now, maybe strength could be the thing that makes you survive in that thing, but like Kropotkin was another evolutionary, and he did a lot of his studies on the steppes in Russia. Well, it's not the strong that survive in the steppes of Russia, it's the people who can, it's the organisms that can cooperate.
Medium is medium for a reason.
Yes, right.
Also, it doesn't matter how long you survive if you didn't procreate past that also.
Right.
in that
That's true.
sense.
Right, so
You
fittedness
are
also
the
means,
greatest
yeah.
at surviving, but don't pass those genes on.
Right, then,
Is that it?
right. So,
It seems to me that the problem is with that phrase, it's not the survival of the fittest, it's the survival of the adaptable.
right, adaptive or yeah, exactly.
Activist.
It wasn't that they were
The-
better,
it-
they just took advantage of what assets they had.
This was Darwin's word, but it meant something different back in his day.
But I think,
You
you
know.
know, that,
But to us, when we
To
hear
us,
it,
yeah.
right, we should substitute the most adapted.
yeah.
So, this is the thing that's sort of radical, too, about de Chardin. We were talking about this earlier. And I could sum this all up into saying, like, in the question of, do rocks have consciousness? Right? How many people think rocks are conscious in some way? Like, nobody, right? Okay. So, but there is
But
this...
they might have George Washington
That's
attitude.
right.
And I think we don't know.
Well, so here,
There's
that's
so
a
many
good...
things we don't know.
Right, that's true. But here's what he meant by it. He didn't really say rocks are conscious. He just said that the precursors of conscious, nothing is created out of nothing, which also got him in trouble. But nothing is created out of nothing. And so, except maybe the Big Bang, we'll say that. And that saves our creation ex nihilo. But he said evolution builds on the past. And yes, again, it's not you build each part and then nothing new happens. Each part comes in, all of a sudden there's a new whole that's beyond the parts, right? That does happen. But the parts are still present. Like if you ever read about the evolution of the eye and how the different parts like came together to create this eye, it's like it like emerged. It wasn't like you could see it, no pun intended, happening, and then all of a sudden it just like we think of evolution and we think of development often as this kind of very stepwise approach, but really there's a kind of stair steps that happen. They become new things when they all come together in the right way. So he thought that you could see interiority way back then. And what he meant by interiority is that organisms and beings have an outside and an inside. You can't have a brain until you have a protected inside. So that's his idea of how interiority can be that. So the point of that, though, was not to get into debates about whether rocks can think or at what level of thinking they have, but rather he was trying to say that all the way back, like this idea that consciousness, he was arguing against the people that said human consciousness is just an accidental aberration of the evolutionary process. We really need to just look at everything from the outside. I just need to look at your atoms, I need to look at your molecules, I need to look at your proteins, your DNA, your organs, etc. But I cannot look at your consciousness and be a scientist. That's the realm of religion. He was saying no. Why? Why? We don't say that just because the bat's wing looks like a flipper, if you take just look at the skeletal structure, we don't say to ourselves, well, there's totally unrelated. We relate them because the flipper came first and then the wing built off the flipper, right? Well, what about consciousness? I think I've told you guys in the past about this book called The Evolution of Beauty. And it was about birds, and like in birds, who is more beautiful normally? And I'm not a bird expert, I know.
The male.
The male, right? Because what's the male trying to do? Right, trying to mate. When we look at birds, what birds do we find? Well, let me just put it this way: Don't we also find the most beautiful bird, don't we find them attractive too? Right? Well, that's kind of interesting, isn't it? Why would birds evolve for us? They didn't. They didn't. But there were precursors of what we call beauty before we ever existed. That's the idea. Does that make sense? I mean, I don't mean do you believe it, but does that make sense what I'm saying? Is it confusing?
Yes and yes.
It is? Okay.
I mean,
They both make sense.
I
Ain't a little
think the
confusing.
reality of it is, there isn't science to explain that much about the consciousness. It's
Right.
not something that we have been able to discover the same way that we have the physical world. So don't be surprised that we don't have the
Yes.
same explanations.
Right. Right.
That's
And-
my whole point.
Right. And it hasn't been studied that much because of the history
They
of
never
science.
thought it mattered.
Right. They bracketed it, they said, we'll get back to that. And then they never really got back to it. So anyway, but he wanted us to get back to it. He said, consciousness displays itself as a spectrum whose lower terms are lost in the night of the past. This is from a modern philosopher, Chalmers. Does anybody Chalmers? Experience is information from the inside. Physics is information from the outside. That's my Ansel Adams thing. The rocks are conscious. That's my picture. And then he as he sort of like was thinking about this interior and exterior, he was like, look, there can be a tendency to kind of like make the interior all about the soul and the exterior all about matter. And he kind of wanted to sort of, he did believe that kind of, but he wanted to kind of not be quite so dualistic. He really was trying to be, so he sort of he kind of changed his thinking a little bit, or I mean, he like explicitly said, I want to really think more about energies, because this is I love this quote from him. He says, to think we must eat, but what a myriad of thoughts comes from one slice of bread. So in other words, and I've said this before, I think, it's not like our thoughts are happening on one level and our brain's physiology is happening on another level, and they're not related. They're totally related, right? Like, I mean, that's why the whole idea of separating the two things, at least discussing in this context, is kind of hard to really, that doesn't make any sense, right? And if I'm in a lot of pain, or I haven't had a lot of sleep, which I haven't, but still, like, my thoughts might be less coherent, So, but then he said, let's think of it a little bit different, and let's not get caught up in this dualism. Let's think of it as energy, and that all energy, in some sense, you could kind of think about as psychic energy, and then he thought about this idea that energy in the universe and in organisms is actually broken up into two different things. There's an energy that connects us to each other, and there is an energy that unifies. And what he meant by that, or connects us to the environment, and then there's an energy. So think about this from a like, and I don't want to get too bogged down in this, but think about this from like on a particle level, right? So he thought of the way that particles interacted with each other and became larger entities. Particles come together, become molecules. Molecules come together, become proteins and stuff like that. And proteins come together to form organs. Like there's this sort of way that. So he thought that as one type of energy. And we can talk about us, right? Like we come together to form this body. This body. I don't mean one. So that's one energy, is the kind of way we bring things in the environment together. The other energy is making whole, right? So just because the particle interacts with things doesn't mean it's going to become something new. But there is another energy that goes into that to actually cause the fusion and cause the next step up, right? Same thing with human beings. Like, just because we're all together in this room doesn't necessarily make us one body. So we have to put other energy into doing this. Like, you have to have speakers to come in that attract people, and that kind of thing. That you want to have good preaching. That's a different kind of energy. So there's an energy that makes unity and an energy that connects. That's how he thought about things. And the whole idea is to think about how these energies go through time. And so if you can sort of fast forward and think, if that's the energy of the universe, what are we heading towards? If the energies are connection and then wholeness, if that's the energy of the universe, that's it. That's all you get, those two. What are you going to end up with?
Unification.
Right. Everything is one. So
It's surprising to me that people didn't automatically link energy and consciousness. I mean, you were talking about being, not having enough sleep or whatever.
right.
But I think all of us have experienced getting excited about something, and that
Our heart
goes-
racing? Yeah.
Well, and then you get the energy to do
Oh,
something.
good point. Yes, that's very good. I like that. Yeah.
And you think of all the authors and musicians or composers that you've heard about that create something in this frenzy of activity because they had the idea. That
The way you're saying the way our interiority kind of
affects
creates
our-
action.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know.
Well, even more than that, there are people who believe that the story exists, and it may go through you, and you have the chance to be
Yeah.
the teller of the
Or
story,
somebody
you
else.
may miss it, and it goes
Yeah.
to the next person, or that statue lives in that piece of marble,
Yeah,
and somebody else
Michelangelo.
showed up with
Yeah,
the hammer.
Yeah.
I mean, there's some truth in that I don't think we can understand at this point.
Right.
How many times have you had a thought, and the person next to you started thinking about being hungry, and the person next to you said, "Let's go to lunch." That energy
Yeah.
was there,
or you thought about somebody and then the phone.
and they showed up.
What'd you say? Always when somebody you're talking bad about somebody? Yeah. And in case you wondered if this was biblical at all, Colossians was one of Teilhard de Chardin's favorite pieces. For God was pleased to have all His fullness dwell in Him, meaning Jesus, and through Him to reconcile Himself all things, whether things on earth or things in heaven. So it's like all in all. So you guys might remember this, and this is going to go to your point about energy, Melinda. So remember, for Teilhard, the whole thing is this evolution, right? And he did not believe like in intelligent design in the way. Does anybody know what intelligent design is? Like, if you're going to just summarize that thought, does anybody know what it is? Could anybody summarize intelligent design?
God intended everything the way it is.
So yeah, that is a form of design, exactly. Intelligent design, though, is a particular theory about evolution. It sort of kind of accepts evolution, but not really, because it says the thing about it, that theory, is that God sort of micromanages evolution, and so a lot of their sort of papers are like, you can't find the real link between this and the eye. Like that kind of thing. And then, of course, science will find the link, and they'll be like, wow, you can't really find the link between, but there is another form of intelligent design where you could think that maybe that this evolutionary process is not just random. It might be random on a micro scale, but maybe it's not completely random on a macro scale. Now, listen, I know everybody's thoughts automatically went to, God has this plan with His book, and He's written in His book the plan, and then He's like, ooh, like the universe is not quite going, let me push it towards. That's not what He meant, okay? He meant it this way. He thought that the story of the universe was unfolding of this without. Remember this idea of this exterior, in the complexity of matter from a physical and chemical point of view, but that there was also this unfolding of the within, starting with just pure inside-outside, and then nascent consciousness, and finally the dawn of thought. But what was the message of him for the dawn of thought? So the dawn of thought was the precursor of love. Okay, so for him, love is not intellectual or just in the sense of some abstract thought, nor it's a mere emotion, but it's this combination of emotion, commitment, compassion, which within it has a sense of action and transcendence. So love pushes us beyond ourselves, and we're no longer merely prisoners of some survival instinct, but builders of a beloved community. So what all that I'm saying, in other words, I could say it this way, like, if you look at the history of the universe from his point of view, what he's saying is, wow, like, the universe not only created these thinking beings, but also created, like, in that evolution, there evolved love, right? Like, and love has transformed in many ways through the years, like, you can read, like, the history of marriage and things like that, and it's not like love, like, back to Mike's point, like, what love was 2,000 years ago is not what we think about love now. Now, you might not think it's, maybe it's not going in the right direction according to you, but it seems to be going in some sort of direction, maybe. At least it's kind of moving somewhere. Even if I said, well, I don't know what the direction is, but it's moving. And that's what he wanted us to see, that it was moving somewhere, And to him, he felt like it was moving forward towards love of each other, and I know the problem with love is it's such a, kind of a word that it's very empty nowadays, I feel. I mean, not nowadays, just that we use it so often, and it's not just that we hug each other all the time, but for him it was this building, this connectivity, this way of building community. And it had, like I said, it had all these sort of components to it. And so what he would say is cosmogenesis, meaning the genesis of the cosmos, led to biogenesis, led to noogenesis, which is mind, led to Christogenesis, which is the birth of love, right? He also called that amorization, amor meaning love, amorization. So, like, for him, it was all getting to this point of Christ. And I'll say this in a later slide if we get there, but it doesn't matter. I can say it now. He thought of the church as a new phylum. He called it the phylum of love. Remember all those little branches? Like, you could do that you could make phylum maps that look similar to that. So you would take the human branch and you put another little branch up here and you put the church. And that's like we have created this new force, this new energy in the universe. The Christian event introduced a new energy to the universe, a new way of going forward, And he meant that very, in some ways, very concretely. This coming together, this early church, what they did, how they taught this charity, and then the evolution of that onto these structures until we get to where we are today. Like, he really thought about that energy as being what we do together and for the world. That's how radical he thought the church could be, like that we were the sort of vanguard of the evolution. So this is his drawing. The only thing I don't like about it is you kind of look at that drawing. I think this is a little bit of a poor way of introducing this information, because you're like, well, why is everything else diverging? But then all of a sudden at the very end, you kind of push it all towards this omega point, right? Like it's sort of like somebody being like, yeah, but then it all comes together. I know it's really messy, but it all comes together in the end. But you have to just think about, what he's trying to kind of get at is the scale. It's almost as if you should sort of show all these dead ends and things like that, and then this kind of movement upwards towards this point of unification. That's what he thought. This is that evolution of the different spheres. I won't really get into this, but I just show you this. That's the complexity. As complexity goes up, so does consciousness. That was the other thing he really thought was kind of interesting, like how things seem to get more and more complex over time. Like we have this whole theory of entropy, right? Like as if the universe is sort of expanding. But when we look at the sort of history of the Earth, it's kind of like you see complexity. And actually, if you look at the history of all these new galaxies being born, it seems almost like there's this energy. Remember, again, back to his two energies. There's this energy that kind of connects things to each other and creates these new wholes.
It is on the previous page. Would he see
Whoops.
Whoops. That. Would he see a connection to the battle between good and evil?
So I'm going to get there. Yes, but yes, that's exactly it. Like in a nutshell, the next couple slides about that are that. Yeah, that there's this and I sort of interrupted you, but let me see if I got what you were going to say. He thinks of evil as kind of the death that's necessary for new life kind of thing, and evolutionary process, I don't just mean the biological evolution, but that like evil is part and parcel of the way creation is because of its freedom, and because and what he'll say, and what later people will say is that like people who follow Teilhard is the thing about the church has to risk stuff like in order to really follow Christ, like because if we think that we can just sort of stay here and protect ourselves and not change, then we're wrong, because the history of the universe is such that yes, there is change, and so evil is part of the process of evolution. Is that kind of what
that's half of it, and the other half of it is, if you go back 1,000 or 1,500 years, right? Somebody might say, oh, the amount of evil and despair that one would experience back then is significantly more than it is today, and in the future it'll be significantly less, right? And so that point there is relative.
Yeah, yes, exactly. Now, he thought there was a real omega point somewhere. He didn't think we could predict it. And I don't necessarily know if you follow de Chardin that you have to actually imagine this one point at some distant temporal time.
Yeah,
but
I think that's the point. It's not a point.
Right.
It's just an evolution of continuing to reduce the despair.
Right. Right. So this is about this is where I am. This is where the evil stuff comes in. So he said, and you have to remember about Teilhard, because you can get this sort of idea in Teilhard that everything's wonderful and everything's going towards this great place in the future. But remember, he suffered through World War I. And he lost a lot of his family members and stuff. He was isolated. He was out in the middle. He was not like a stranger to suffering somehow, like some privileged person. I mean, maybe you could compare him to somebody else and say he was more privileged. But he knew suffering. And he says, we could see a universe that is involuted and interior. He meant, by involution, he meant that whole process of creating an interior. Think about the way a cell, that it kind of comes back on itself. If you think about the way an embryo develops, it sort of folds over on itself to create this inner and outer. That's what he mean by involution. And it's also a universe that labors, sins, and suffers. We talk about dead ends. This is from so I had to give this talk on death and dying, and I came across this quote from Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, which I think speaks to this a little bit. She said grief, and she insisted on this, grief was a natural emotion. Remember, when she was writing, people didn't confront death very well. Like, this is the late 60s, and death was kind of this thing that happened, it was over and done. She was trying to sort of understand grief and, in a sense, normalize it for people so that we could, especially for healthcare providers, but also anybody, could sort of realize that there is this sort of thing called grief, and it's not pathology. It's not pathological. It's something that's natural. And she thought it was natural. It was sort of an evolutionary thing almost, because life is full of loss. And so the reason I think I felt like that was appropriate to this is because we don't always want to say that, like that life, like the Buddhists would put it, life is suffering, like I don't know if I want to go that far, but I mean that we all suffer, we all lose, and that's part and parcel of it. And if we always just focus on the omega, we're just keep going toward that omega point, we really sort of deny the kind of other parts of our life. And Dahlio, the one that maybe we'll get a little chance to talk a little bit about her, she'll say, really, that kind of next step in sort of religious consciousness is this ability to kind of embrace all of life and all of its contradictions and all of our contradictions and not run from it,
Precious has no meaning in a world where there is no loss.
Yeah.
I mean, you can't appreciate anything being special, unique, and precious, or beauty, if you don't have some other level to understand it against.
There is a poem that I use a lot when I talk about this by Naomi Shabib Nye called Kindness. Have you ever heard that one? It says, "You will never know kindness until you have lost things." think she was trying to say that,
I
like,
think that's true,
yeah.
but not everybody does.
Well, but I don't think she meant like they're automatic, like a person that experiences satisfaction has to experience unsatisfaction, but rather we wouldn't have a concept called satisfaction if we didn't have a concept called unsatisfaction.
But that's part of the belief in a hell and a heaven is a
Like a dualism.
dualism.
Yeah, but it doesn't. But you could be non-dualistic by saying like they're part of the same whole.
But people who only believe in heaven and don't believe in hell makes heaven less special.
I don't know. I
wouldn't
don't
agree
like
with
that. There was actually an ancient theologian who said, in the end of the day, even the devil will be saved. You know, that was Orton.
Yes, but you have to believe in a devil. That's the difference.
Yeah, okay.
Right.
I
If
get you.
there's only heaven and only perfection, it goes to what Belinda and everybody says, then you don't have the downside.
Well, you know, Thich Han said this thing once about heaven. He said, you know, I don't believe in a heaven without suffering because suffering teaches compassion. And I think compassion is a heavenly virtue. You know, whether you believe that or not, I don't know. But his point is that, you know, that without some experience of hardship, you don't know what it is. You learn something
I only
from
mean
it.
that there are people who
Do,
believe in
right.
only the good side of things.
Right, no, I got you. So this is, so back to this idea of evil in the universe. So this is the kind of, this looks beautiful, but really it's the birth of a star. You know, so think of all the, like the heat and the sort of chaos that's happening in that picture. This is an artist's rendition of early Earth, you know, and it's volcanoes and, you know, the kind of chaos and would be horror. This is representing the theory that a meteor came in and introduced new chemicals into the earth. Whether you believe that or not, I don't know, but that's what that is. And of course, you know, that nature is red in tooth and claw. And then there's social evil too, you know, so the cross and the lynching tree. So let me, I think what I want to do is kind of skip. Let me see. Yeah, so I think we could like
Make a word
skip
out
over
of
this
that.
a little bit. We can skip, even though I think this is a cool point. I'll let it go. And I just want to give you a little bit about Ilia Dahlio because we did, and she's not that different than Teilhard. I just want to sort of point out a couple things about her. So I just want to give you again that sense of the time. 14.7, Earth solidified 4.5. The first tool, so human ancestors are 5.7 million years old. The first tools were found were dated about 2.5 million years ago, and then humans are 130,000 years ago, and then Jesus was born only 2,000 years ago, and the church only emerged about 40 to 50 years after that. So when you think about this, thinking about the time scales there, it's just massive and crazy.
You know, with the ghost particles, the neutrinos, they think the universe is going to, at a minimum, be about 6 billion years old instead of 14.7.
Oh, really? About 6? Okay.
Yeah, it's just, they're still figuring it out.
That's interesting.
but
That's an old figure then.
Yeah, I mean, no, this is just in July.
They just figured this out.
Discovered the ghost particles.
The ghost, yeah, I did hear about something like that. Okay, that's
Yeah,
interesting.
And that may actually, depending upon the
Shorten it.
impact, it may also invalidate the Big Bang with a different mechanism.
Oh, really?
Yeah, but it's
Interesting.
still the same concept.
Right, I get you. Right, exactly. Of evolution and
Yeah.
evolutionary, universe. Interesting. Well, it's funny because you know one of Teilhard's arguments for the connection of everything was ether, because it hadn't been quite invalidated by the Michelson-Morley experiments. So, and that's the thing about when you think about science, and especially a layperson like myself talking about some of these science evolves, science changes, but the point is a lot of these concepts of evolution and
It's the same,
is
yeah.
going to be the same. It's just you'll switch out different things. Anyway, that's a sort of picture of the universe and the life. So, Ilia Dahlio, this kind of goes back. We talked a little bit about this. Does anybody know about chaos theory? I'm sure Dan does. Anybody know about chaos theory at all? Yeah. So, chaos theory is this idea that complexity emerges not in a step-by-step process, but kind of almost like suddenly. Like so So you can explain some complex systems based upon the interactions of its component parts with very simple rules, and those simple rules will lead to greater and greater complexity. So, for instance, one of the theories, and I'm not sure I have all the science of this completely in my head, but my understanding about the way ants work is that there's no like overarching mind, obviously, directing everything. One ant has this rule of what he does when the ant in front of him and the ant what's happening to the ant in front of him and the ant behind him. And then you get these huge hives and these things. So the complexity emerges from these simple rules. So what Ilia Dahlio kind of thought about that, she was like, she thought, well, what if we thought about God's creation and what is God's intention in creation, so that like when God created the universe and the universe did what it did, like it of course was going to end up with all these complex interactions. That was part of the free process of creation. This kind of chaos that that complexity emerges, not necessarily like complexity can emerge even when creation is evolutionarily. Like it doesn't have to have a micromanaging God in order for complexity to emerge, And again, it goes back to this idea that things are going to be dead ends and stuff like that. So I want to skip to one other thing, because we only have a few things left here. We could talk about the zygote in a second. I don't want to do that right now.
As much understanding as we have had now as what was all thought incorrectly getting us to this point.
Right.
Why would anybody begin to think at this point they have the answer?
Right, exactly. Good point.
I mean,
Yeah,
that seems so ridiculous. If we haven't learned anything from the fact that we got so much wrong, why can we not understand that science is still an art, is still evolving, and we will not understand.
Right.
We just have to live in our moment with the pieces we understand and appreciate that you may have some of it right and you may have some of it right. And in the whole, hopefully we're moving to this evolution.
Right. Right. And I do think that Teilhard would say the same thing, and I know Ilia Dahlio would say the same thing. Like, you don't have to picture the omega point and write, oh, here are all the characteristics of the omega point. Like, he didn't think of that. It was what Dan was saying. It's really more of this kind of thing that's sort of pulling things along, if you will, or whatever. It's it's kind of a concept. It's a sort of projection based upon what we're experiencing now. But it's not meant to be like, now I know exactly today, like, oh yes, communism is going to be part of the omega point. Like, we don't know,
Well, I wasn't even really thinking about this as much as the world who wants to say this is it. This
Right.
is the answer.
We're done.
You
Yeah.
don't freaking know.
Yeah. Right.
Well, I
You
think
don't.
I think people today generally know more that they don't know than they did in the past.
But I
Because
don't
if you
know
went
that
back,
they're
if you went
accepting
back
of that.
1,000 years, they got it all figured out. Today, I think more generally, it's shifted toward we don't know what we don't
That's
know.
probably much kinder than
And
I
I
was
mean,
being.
just in July,
Right.
we discovered these particles that are ghost particles. They have no charge. That's why we didn't find them. The mass is very small, but there are 100 billion of them go through you every single second, right? And so it's just something else that nobody could have even imagined that, right? However many even months ago, and they just.
Some of our fiction writers have it.
Yes, I.
And we talked about the fiction.
But
Yeah.
the other point that Dan could make too is like we don't know whether there's going to be another Copernican style revolution at some point. Even like we don't know that. We think it all is going along and it's going to be more of the same in some sense. But like maybe the ghost particles will actually completely revolutionize our understanding of the mind and things. So let me get this. The last point I want to make. I just think this is cool about Dahlio. She thinks that it's not like the part of being part of this phylum of love is not just thinking about it and not just coming up with new Christologies like we're just doing today, but it's also trying to live this Christ life. And the way we kind of know what that is through practices, liturgical practices, as well as other types of practices like prayer and other things. So I like that addition because she's trying to say basically just like she's trying to put her money where her mouth is or whatever. You know, she's saying, look, it's not just like thinking of Christ in a new way, like, oh yeah, I think I can reconcile Christ with evolution. It's really saying, if you really believe that Christ is in evolution and that we're supposed to be part of this new Christ life, well then go live it, you know. And it's very Franciscan because, you know, back in Francis's day, one of the phrases was people would say, I'm going to go live a life of penance. Okay? Now, when you think of a life of penance, you might think, I'm going to sort of mortify myself. I'm going to fast a lot. And That's not what it meant back then. What it meant was, I'm going to go join with some other people who think like me and I'm going to try to live a Christ-like life. And that could have meant different things. There was many different communities that did that, one of which were the Franciscans. And so Dahlio is kind of telling us to do the same thing. Like, not join the Franciscans necessarily, but like, try to live a life of penance. Try to live what you think Christ is. And part of that is getting together with others that you think you could learn from. That's part of the energy of love. That's what makes us co-creators, as Dahlio says, is this attempt to live Christ. Remember, this is Christogenesis. We're part of the Christogenesis, which is still ongoing, according to her. So that's all I want to say. And I like this line. She said, Christ brings a new heart to humanity. And that's it. I'm done.
Shut us off.
That's right. Thanks, everybody.
It's always good with a big finish.
That's right.